I'll hand over to you, Gregor. Yeah, over to you, Gregor.
Great.
Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks. Well, thank you very much to Talk for Health, Mike and Nikki, for landing me safely here and for inviting me to speak with you. It's interesting to use the word controversial and a civil servant, which I'm an ex-civil servant, in the same sentence. So I will maybe try and buck the trend. I'll try not to be controversial, but sometimes that may just slip out. But it's not purposeful. What I've really like to do, first of all, I'll introduce myself to you a little bit so you get a bit of background. And once you've got the context to me, you'll probably understand why I'll be saying some of the things I'm saying. And then I'll just explain that the presentation I'm going to make with you is something that we'll do together. And we're going to do it in two halves. And I'll explain what those are later. And at any point in time after the first kind of introduction, really welcome a little bit of dialogue, because to turn up on is it Tuesday today? A Tuesday at 6 o'clock and be talked at for an hour would just be insufferable. So let's not do that. Okay, so my background. Latterly, I was the director of mental health at Public Health England, and I was there for 8 years and was there during the whole time of COVID, which was a very interesting time to be at an agency like Public Health England. And as some of you will know, 3/4 of the way through the COVID pandemic, the government decided it was going to change the role of Public Health England and create a UK health security agency. I was really, we were working hard on the front line around COVID, and some of the things really struck me about how the lack of human interaction, socially isolated, how we are naturally social beings, was affected by that. And that really got me thinking about lots of different things, which I'll share with you later. I left Public Health England. If any of you have ever worked in central government, you'll know that things usually get reorganized every 2 or 3 years. So you kind of get used to reorganizations and reshuffles. But this one seemed very different in nature. And I took the opportunity to exit stage left. And I think from what I've seen in terms of what's been happening to mental health and also the public health approach and the talk about prevention, but no particular real political will to do anything about it, I think I made the right decision, and I'm certainly enjoying my portfolio life. So prior to that, I did lots of different things, but something you should know about me is that my father was a psychiatrist and my mom was a special needs teacher, and we were born into and grew up on the grounds of a psychiatric hospital in the north of Scotland. And my world was very different from the world of people around about me. And when my world collided with the outside world when I went to school, and I'd invite friends to come back and play, and wasn't there always a long drive at the end of the hospital? And I'd say, they would look up the driveway and say, "You live there?" And I said, "Yeah, that's where I live. Would you like to come in and play?" And for me, it was really telling that the world I saw as normal was not seen as normal by the world outside. And that kind of has stuck with me ever since. I tried to shake off the kind of mental health anorak, but it's one of those things that just comes comfortably back on. And in whatever I've done in my working life, it's always been something that has been there all the time. And for many of you here, you will both be providing services and using services. And like the majority of people, I have used services at some point in my life and have availed myself of a range of different talking therapies, and my family also. So I come at this topic with a lot of, yes, professional and theoretical and intellectual and strategic observation, but I also come at it from a very personal standpoint. And whatever will happen in the future to talking therapies, they are an essential part of what it means to be human. They're an essential part of what it is to learn more about yourself, your context, and the environment and the circumstances that you find yourself in. So let's get that straight up front at the beginning, that whatever I'll be talking about, I truly believe in the importance of a range of talking therapies. Let's start now by saying what I'm going to try and do. So it's going to be a presentation in two parts. The first part is going to be about the context, really. Where are we now? What's the landscape look like? And then we'll pause for a moment. I'll have some interaction with you, ask some questions, make some points about where you think talking therapies have got to in the current landscape. And then secondly, I'll offer some observations and some personal reflections on where I think it might be going and what are some of the things in the mental health arena that may both challenge, support, and put into question some of the talking therapies as we know them. So let me just start by saying my definition of talking therapies is really broad. It encompasses arts and creative therapies, behavioral, cognitive, dialectical, humanistic, mindfulness-based, person-centered, psychoanalytic, and solution-focused. And all of these can be done individually, they can be done in groups, with families, with partners, and you can combine obviously individual and group, and talking therapies can be online and face-to-face. And I think if we accept that broad definition of it, then we're off to a kind of shared start and understanding of what we mean by talking therapies. I'm not necessarily of the view that talking therapies need to be always done by someone with a professional qualification, and that might be something we might want to venture into as we start exploring where we are now and what might help in the future, or where it might go in the future. I mean, the context, obviously, you know more than I do about the early history of talking therapies and the start of psychoanalysis in the early 19th century. Was it Sigmund Freud, or was it Anna O and Joseph Brera? But it's really interesting to see how things have developed. And in my career in mental health, it started in the mid 80s, and the first job I had was closing long-stay psychiatric institutions and setting up community services. And talking therapies weren't really something that we talked about. We were about community living, we were about community transformation, we were about supporting people to live the lives they wish to live in the community. And then in the 80s, in the 1990s and 2000s, there was a bit of a kind of revolution towards a little bit of a deeper understanding and awareness of what some of the more common mental health problems were doing, and that some of the drug therapies were not really hitting the mark. So boldened by the health economist Lord Layard, it was a journey into what became known as improving access to psychological therapies, where he used his policy knowledge. Lord Layard used his policy knowledge and his access to the corridors of power across Westminster to argue very strongly that we were missing an opportunity here to introduce at scale a large-scale program of talking therapies to reduce depression, anxieties, to increase people's abilities to cope with some of their problems, and therefore create situations where there was immediate access to services that were known then as improving access to psychological therapies, or a range of psychological therapies. And I was not involved at the beginning, but I was part of a government internal departments that brought the birth of IAPT to life. And when I look back on all of those years, so 2008, October 2008, it started. And that really signaled a bit of a revolution and a step change in talking therapies in this country. And if I look at the latest statistics I was able to get my hands on, in 2021-22, 1.81 million people were referred to what was known as IAPT. 1.24 million entered treatment, and 688,000 adults finished that treatment. 66.5% of them were women, and in terms of waiting time, 91% of people were waiting less than 6 weeks. I don't know what the figures are now, but it did really cause an absolute revolution in terms of how this country and the population viewed talking therapies. Then we were witnessing what was more like the beginning of an online journey. Many people had already been going online to do CBT therapies online. Oh yeah, the other thing I should say about IAPT is it was by far and away dominated by CBT. It was over 46% of all the talking therapies delivered were CBT. Whilst computerized cognitive behavioral therapy had been going in terms of online sessions and people using those sessions. And that's increased over time. And during COVID, when services were pivoting to offer digital and online solutions, we saw another pick in terms of what was accessible for the public. And in Scotland, these are the only figures I could find for online referrals. And in Scotland, computerized cognitive CBT, over 30,000 referrals a year. And that accounts for nearly a third of all CBT in Scotland. So there's some amazing statistics and progress that have been made in relation to talking therapies. And I'm happening on IAPT because it is the biggest program. And when I was looking for some of the information and literature around policy for talking therapies, I couldn't really find anything recent. I found something in 2011, which I remember, which was the 4-year plan for the advancement of talking therapies in England, which was around the time that Paul Burstow was the Minister for Mental Health. And it was interesting that I haven't really seen anything since then, apart from the continued rollout of IAPT. But in 2023, IAPT changed its name this year to the NHS Talking Therapies Programme. I'm not sure what that signifies, but I think it moves something towards something where the public may have more sense of understanding around what it is that IAPT is. And we've moved to situations now with self-referral, access to talking therapies online. At the same time, we still see that counselling and psychotherapy is not under any statutory regulatory legislation, but there are guidelines that anybody who wishes to call themselves a counsellor or a psychotherapist the guidelines say should have completed a diploma and will have had a minimum of 400 hours of training and exposure to that training. So I'm kind of left with a landscape, and I'm rushing this part of it because I want to get into the meat of the future. What we see now is a range of talking therapies that are open to self-referral. People obviously can access a whole set of different ones, whether it's peer support, group therapies, anything that can be online. Children and young people, there are a range of talking therapies available in schools, available if you're lucky enough through local child and adolescent mental health services. And there are multidisciplinary teams attached to a large number of schools, not the majority of schools. And you've got organizations like Place to Be providing counseling in school settings, and a move towards whole school approaches in schools where talking therapies are one of a number of different offers made for children, parents, and also teachers within the school setting. What's interesting is there has been some criticism that talking therapies have meant that policy has been dominated over the last 20 years in terms of investments and awareness around mental health of being far more towards depression and anxiety, leaving those with severe and complex mental illness, who we're probably dealing with more solidly in terms of mental health policy in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, not really benefiting as much from some of the policy investment and policy landscape. That might be something that we wish to discuss and reflect on. So while talking therapies have moved very close to public awareness and central in the public's mind, it would seem that some of what we used to be doing towards those with severe and enduring mental illness haven't quite benefited at the same time. So there's some other issues there. There's also the issue of the professionalism of talking therapies, whether it's by counselors, well-being practitioners, a new category of staff, psychologists or psychiatrists. And I marvel at the the number of clinical and non-clinical workforce that's involved in talking therapies. But I wanted to share with you something that I saw passing around on Twitter today. This was from Professor Robin Murray, who some of you may know from King's College London and the Institute of Psychiatry. He was doing a talk about psychiatry and its place in the world. And one of the questions he asked himself, or was posing to the audience at a convention that's taking place in Liverpool just now, which is the International Royal College of Psychiatrists Conference. He was, on one of his slides, he said, psychiatry has largely contracted out talking therapies to psychologists and counselors, even though talking therapies were initially developed by psychiatrists. And he asked the question, is this a wise move that talking therapies are largely contracted out to other professions? It's an interesting standpoint, and one that kind of made me stop and think for a moment. But when I think about where we are now in terms of the landscape, I think the landscape has shifted enormously. There has been a huge increase in public awareness, but has that awareness brought with it a lack of differentiation between terminologies of mental well-being, mental health problems, mental health challenges, mental illness, mental disorder? Have we somehow conflated and confused the identification of mental health problems with something that needs psychiatric and psychological treatment, whereas maybe what would help more would be some social, psychological, more emotional responses? So have we, in our pursuit of greater mental health awareness, greater traction for talking therapies to deal with mild to moderate problems and to deal with the rising numbers or reported rising numbers of self-reported anxiety and depression, have we somehow begun to move mental health policy away from those that might need mental illness treatment services most? Or are we more egalitarianly or more sharing in the equality of what it is to have a mental health challenge and to provide possible solutions and ways of alleviating and responding to those challenges? That's the first challenge that I see in terms of the current landscape. The second is that, have we increased inequalities over the last 10, 20 years in terms of access to mental health services? Have we defined our treatments in a slightly more westernized view of what are acceptable treatments? Have we lost a few different cultural variances along the way? Are our services really reaching out to disenfranchised communities, or are we creating additional inequalities? And with that comes, have we started to look at people's social circumstances, their life circumstances and socioeconomic pressures, and quite categorically the challenges that they face in life, and try to offer a band-aid of talking therapies to deal with really social and structural challenges? And will we ever have the workforce that we think is needed to meet the numbers of people that we identify as having mental health challenges that would benefit from talking therapies? And if we don't have the means and ability to get the workforce that we think is the workforce we should have for talking therapies, what are we doing to open up the talking therapy skills to peers, to others, to people who wish to engage themselves in a level of knowledge and understanding that enables them to hold a safe space, to enable people to talk freely and openly about what is availing them, and to help find solutions that not only help the person in distress, but also help the person that is giving some of the advice, guidance, and support through talking therapies. Let me pause and break there and leave you with some of those challenges. And Mike, if I may just open it up to about 5-10 minutes of reflections and discussions from people, because I think some of the challenges I'd love to hear your take on what you think, where we've got to and what you feel some of the challenges are, And then as we move into the next part of the presentation or the talk, I'm going to offer up a little bit of insights into what the future might look like.
Yeah, that sounds great. So feel free to just jump in with questions, put your hand up, or pop them in the chat, and I'll keep track of the questions if anyone wants to ask any. Yeah, go for it, Andrew.
Gregor, I'm really curious about CBT, because so many psychologists and psychotherapists have very negative reactions to it. They talk about its origins, and it's sometimes described almost as like the guy's doing the 5-card trick outside Harrods. But it's like a sort of, it doesn't really address, it's like a sort of sticking plaster. And for me, it's rather similar to medication that GPs prescribe because they don't have time to really consider other options. So it's like, for me, it's been putting someone on a deep freeze and they remain in the land of the living dead, but they think they're being treated. I just hope that's not too brutal, but that's my experience of it. And particularly for trauma experiences, for me, it doesn't work. It's never worked. And also, the psychodynamic therapy, I found that difficult. But I find so much is down to the actual practitioner. I had therapy from a most amazing Hungarian doctor. I didn't even really have to sort of talk to her. She just knew all about me. When I looked her up on the web, I found she'd written all these books and was really experienced. But she just knew all about me. And that's, you can't quantify that. It's an art rather than a science. Thank you.
Andrew, thank you. I mean, I think my reflection is that with the opening up of improving access to psychological therapies, CBT was the one that was promoted and pushed the most because it had an evidence base. It was easy to scale because it involves 8, 10, 12 sessions, and it's quite manualized. And I think the proof is in the name, cognitive behavioral therapy, orienting how you think and trying to get your thought processes moving in the right direction. It's not for everyone, it's not for every issue, but it has got a very strong, solid evidence base. We might want to debate how evidence-based and science-based is constructed in our psychological and psychiatric and mental health services, but we probably wouldn't have the time to do that justice this evening. But I do think it's as you said, it's something about, and I'll touch upon that in the next part, it's something about the relationship that you have with the practitioner and the human connection that evokes and drives. And there are criticisms of CBT in relation to it being over manualized, yet some people say we can't have 1001 versions of CBT. We've got to have a version of CBT that stays true to the evidence. So I think we are dealing with operationalizing something which cuts to the core of what it is to be human. So I'm kind of sitting on the fence of this one. I've seen it work, I've known it to work, but it doesn't work for everyone. I can see Zandra's hand, Steve, and Anthony. Should we go in that order?
Great. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Fantastic. So thank you so much, Gregor, for your talk. I enjoyed it very much. I would like to ask you, we could go back to a point that you have made. If I understood well, if I hear you well, I think that you said that Professor Robert Myrin had claimed that talking therapies were developed by psychiatrists. And yeah, we're just wondering, what do you think about that? I mean, you started your talk saying that you would approach, or you would use a definition of talking therapies that was quite broad. And then you went to say that talking therapies, or talking, for therapeutic purposes is almost like a human essential thing that we do.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering if, such a claim, if I heard it well, it is really helpful when we think about talking therapies and the future in terms of, broadening it and, practicing in different ways that are more human and allow for connection. probably close to what happened between humans before we had psychiatry, I guess. Yeah.
Well, isn't it amazing? I mean, you know, I've got to choose my words carefully here, because I love psychiatrists and I am the son of one. And I think they do a fantastic job in amazingly difficult circumstances. But what I have observed over my career, and there was a guy I used to work with in the recovery movement who used to judge the success of his talks by the number of psychiatrists that left the room when he first started out. And towards the end of his career, he judged the success of his talks by the number of psychiatrists that stayed in the room. So I feel that there is room here for an integral way of looking at the purpose and contribution of a range of disciplines. And I was surprised at Robin Murray's statement. So I'll be perfectly honest with you. I thought it was misguided and takes us back to a point in history where anything with the words mental health would be looked to for psychiatry to have the answers. And I think we should be much more generous in our ability to see that mental health is such a broad, complex issue that no one discipline is ever going to have a monopoly over it. So I felt that that was taking us back. And I welcome the fact that we have psychologists, we have behavioral therapists, we have art therapists, we have peer support, we have peer workers, we have a range of people, professional, non-professional, clinical, non-clinical, engaged in the practice of therapeutic talking. And that can only be to the benefit of us as humans, the problems we face. So I was surprised by that and disappointed. And I don't think many of my current and progressive psychiatric colleagues would have gone along with that statement, if that helps answer your question. Steve, then Anthony. Steve, are you there?
Thanks, Gregor. Yeah, thanks. Sorry, I was on mute. Thanks for your share so far. I've got a couple of points. First of all, in terms of if we look at the counselling and therapist side of things, the actual training that you said about 400 hours, I think it deters certain parts of society from actually becoming counsellors and therapists because of the excessive cost and the very little state or support from anywhere that's available. So you do tend to find that there's certain demography. If you go on the counsellors directory, there is a certain demography that you'll see is overrepresented, and I think there needs to be more done to make talking therapies in that area more relevant to the society that they're actually supporting. The second point, I've done some work with some medical students, and I was shocked at the little amount of time that they have in terms of training general medical students on mental health. And a lot of the time the training, and this is at the Maudsley, they did some training, and that was primarily on a volunteer basis. So they didn't have to actually have to do the modules. So a GP particularly are the first point of contact for referring to things like talking therapies. But if they've got no real knowledge of how to refer and what types of options are available, just in a 15-minute or whatever session you get, what chances has the person got to go to the right place at the first time? So in effect, it's quite a cost-ineffective way of funneling people or signposting people to the right support. So I think there needs to be more education at the front end, and I think with that would help. That's just an observation.
Two fantastic points. Couldn't agree more about the excessive cost to train. There are organizations trying to do things about that, but I think that would require a little bit more central policy government effort. I think that one organization I work with, The Place to Be, they have volunteer counselors, and through their volunteering, they make up the hours and they get a good training and background supervision, etc., which is helpful. But they find that they have an overrepresentation of white middle-class women doing the training, and they've made lots of efforts to try and broaden out their demographic. And there are many successful ways that they've attempted to do that, and that's definitely going in the right direction. I was working with a startup called Zinc VC, and we were doing work on children's mental health. And there were a number of young Black entrepreneurs who were really coming into this space. And one of them is a woman called Agnes, who set up an organization called Black Minds Matter, and really to try and find access for people to Black therapists. And again, that goes with all the training. Great point. General medical students, well, yeah, it surprised me back in the 80s when I was teaching medical students, medical sociology, and it surprises me still now. And also when I look at psychiatric training, it's mostly always hospital-based with a little bit in the community. So we're not training the current crop of future professionals in the right way. So I think that demands a much more different workforce plan than we've had unveiled by the government and NHS England. And I think we need to be task shifting. And if there's one area we can shift task to, it's in the area of mental health. We over-professionalize it. And I think that complicates how we respond to it. And in the time of need, when resources are tight, it's always the loudest professional voices that seem to carry the sway of government. And when I was in government, I argued heavily that the 500 million earmarked to deal with COVID, that the vast majority of that should go to local authorities to deal with the implications of what was happening to mental health in communities during COVID. And I think at the end of the day, we got 10% of the budget allocated to local authorities, and 90% went to the NHS to be spent on the same things that always get spent. Anthony.
Hello, Gregor. Yeah, you asked about inequalities in the treatment of the different groups of people who with mental health issues. I have a severely enduring mental health issues, and if I wanted to, I'm in therapy at the moment, but if I wanted to start from scratch, the waiting list in the area I live in is East London for psychosis is about 8, 9, 10 months, or on the severe mood and anxiety and personality disorder, it's about 2 years. And I'm thinking, that's not really going to help. Some people are sitting there, they're on the waiting list, they're just waiting, and they're just being told to wait. And that gap is getting bigger and bigger, whereas IAPT, you can go to IAPT and get help very quickly.
Yeah, it astounds me that the point made by Steve about GPs and general medical training, there are a lot of GPs that go out of their way to learn more about mental health, and that's to be welcomed, but we don't make it easy for them. And they are a gateway to secondary services. And there are lots of different things. I work for a digital organization that has this amazing peer support platform. And I don't understand why when someone comes into a GP's waiting room and they're assessed as requiring some form of talking therapy or mental health support, they aren't directed to these evidence-based platforms where they can get peer support, a whole range of other things, because it just smacks again of waiting till you see the right professional. A lot of people on this call, a lot of people here this evening know the value of people helping other people. And I just find it astonishing that, we don't have access all areas, and we haven't got an open access to things that will help people. And for a very, very limited cost, we could reduce waiting lists. And many people who are on waiting lists, because they're waiting for treatment, some of them just need one short intervention and they're fine, a single session. Some people actually find things that help themselves, and 6 months down the line, when they're near the end of the waiting list, they say, well, actually, I'm okay now. So there are lots of different things. And there's a thing in Scotland called distress brief interventions, which deals with people in moments of distress. They don't need to be mentally ill or clinically diagnosed. They're just in distress. And they have a 24, 48-hour service response that looks after them and responds to them. And if they need it, they have 2 weeks. And I just think those ways of shifting the tasks, using different workforces, would really lead us to a much better place. And I think, like you, those with severe and enduring mental illness have really been shortchanged over the last 10, 15 years. And we need to be finding ever more efficient ways of reaching out to them. And I do think, whilst digital isn't the solution to everything, it does provide something. And there was a case of a ward that was closed during COVID, and all the inpatients and those that were due to come into the service were contacted. They were looked after by telephone. They were looked after by video conferencing, et cetera, And when COVID was over, they went, oh, you'll be pleased to know the ward is open again. And they went, we don't want to come back to the ward. We've been looked after so well at home. We don't want to come back to the ward. We think that would be detrimental to our mental health. So there are lots of different things that we could do. Max, I see your hands up.
Just quickly, sorry, I know, just to say to Pac, I know you had a question in there, but it seems like there's sort of similar question that Anthony answered. So hopefully that was that kind of covered your question. But yeah, I'll let you pass over to Matt. Thanks, Gregor.
Hi, Matt. You got your hand up.
Yeah, hi there, Gregor. Well, I wanted to ask a situation with my parents. Both would have been classed as cluster B. The problem that I had, and I think a lot of people have, is social services and psychiatrics not agreeing who is responsible. And like with my parents, they just got kicked into the long grass and this dispute wasn't resolved. What I would like to know is, do you know if in the future that problem is going to be resolved, so people with severe conditions like the cluster B personality disorders, not classed as mental health, are they going to start to get some help and support instead of being kicked into the long grass?
Yeah, great point, Matt. I think this opens up the whole issue around what are mental health challenges, what are mental health problems, what are some of the solutions that we can use to alleviate some of the suffering. And, you know, they're social. Mental health, mental illness is socially created, socially destroyed, and socially looked after. And I think we have this constant battle between psychiatric and mental health services and social services. And it must just be an absolute, such a challenge being a frontline social worker. But there are some places that blend those health and social care skills really, really well. They share responsibility. They know that the psychiatrist may be able to provide some medications. It may be able to provide some deep insights into the diagnosis of a person's condition. But without the social supports, that's not going to mean anything in terms of improving someone's life and life circumstances. And I think one of the things that is really interesting is there's an organization called Thalamus that looks to digitalize the Mental Health Act. And all they're doing is putting all agencies together and making it easier for the patient and their relatives to understand what's happening to them and make the care much more synchronous and much more coordinated. And we should be seeing those things as a matter of course, because if an intervention is working well for someone, it can be so easily undone by their social circumstances. Hence the absolute importance of social care, which, you know, is another bugbear of mine and many others, is that social care doesn't get the same policy presence as it needs and has suffered from that over the last 10 to 12 years. So, you know, and I know that what creates a difference in someone's life is having the support of everybody around about them, like an open dialogue situation that they've been trialing in Finland and doing also in the UK. There's a couple of open dialogue sites. And if, you know, that works, you put all the care around the individual and their needs, their family, their neighbors, their work colleagues, their friends, the therapists. It's really quite interesting. And if you haven't seen that, then just Google open dialogue. It's really quite interesting. Mike, I'm going to probably just move into the future for the last 10, 15 minutes. And then, sorry, Carol, I just saw your hand go up there, but can I leave that till the next bit and I'll race through the bits about the future? Is that okay, Mike?
Yeah, sure. Just one quick thing to ask is Philip had just asked what's the name of the platform, or if you could spell it out
Together All is the peer support platform.
I think it was Thalamus, she said in the chat.
Oh, and Thalamus is the other one. So yeah. And I don't receive any money from Thalamus, but I receive a monthly advisory contract with Together All. So you know that information, knowing that I'm mentioning these products. Some pay me and some don't. So that's the declaration of interest.
Sorry, can you just spell it? Because I'm not sure if I got it right. Is it Thalamus or is it something else?
Thalamus. I never asked the founder why he called it Thalamus. Okay, let's move into the next part of my time with you. So I just wanted to throw a few things up in the air and just talk about some of those in relation to what I'm seeing happening around talking therapies. The first is AI, artificial intelligence. Well, everything I read says it does help, it could help, it can help, but, and I think, you know, we should be excited about the movement in technology, shouldn't we? And some people, you know, those who really wish to promote AI, and through things like ChatGPT, which is brought to life by the company called OpenAI, which, interesting, I'm living in Italy at the moment, and Italy banned OpenAI for a few months until they were persuaded by the European Union and others that wasn't a particularly progressive step. However, some people have said about AI-assisted therapy through a chatbot that I felt heard. It was better than my therapist. And it didn't cost me anything, or it cost me very little. And then I found a quote from Thomas Insel, and some of you may know who he was. He was the director of the National Institute for Mental Health in America. And he went big down the digital line. He was even employed by Google for a while. And he says, you know, in mental health, we don't have procedures, we have conversations. But an anthropologist in the same article said, yeah, but algorithms have improved, but I don't think they're going to address the really intricate social relationships that people are in when they seek help. And I think, you know, in the 1990s, some people have been using cognitive behavioral therapy online courses. There are organizations like Wobot Health and WISA who use AI. Now, there is a shortage of mental health professionals, and there is a shortage of access for marginalized communities. Severely mentally ill don't get a huge, great shout and everything. And there are ways in which we can use AI to offload documentation. We can give the reporting to machines. And there was a study done with peer support platforms where the advice that was given by the peer supporters was run through an AI chatbot, and the ones that they gave were more liked by the peers on the platform than the ones that people gave. However, that wasn't universal, and people generally prefer humans. Or could we move to a future where we have AI and human interaction in a very sophisticated blended way? Those in AI say it's not there to replace, but to supplement the care that people receive. And that's good. And, you know, AI is available to you at any point in time. But also not talking to a human, sometimes for people that reduces the value-based judgments that might be made on them. It reduces the shame and anxiety stakes. But it does bring with it an automation bias and a Western bias, and it misses cultural elements. And it's not really been put into clinical settings in any significant way yet. And there are moves to regulate AI. WISA, one of the companies in America, is trying to get its CBT chatbot to be approved by the FDA as a medical device. And here's a challenge and a question to you. If we can't get as many therapists that we need, do we think that AI will open up more access to talking therapies for people? And in the words of Thomas Insel, is it better to have some therapy some talking therapy than none? And is it better to get an army of people empowered with these AI tools, and would that help? Or do we just try and fill the gap in terms of demand and supply with waiting for the workforce? So that's the first area, AI. The second area I just want to range into for a little bit is peer-to-peer. I've been a massive supporter of peer-to-peer, and when I see peer support workers employed in the NHS, it really gladdens my heart, because I remember one of the things, my father was a very progressive psychiatrist, and one of the things that he did in the 60s in the hospital that we were living in, he would always spot the people in the wards who had the confidence of others. And, you know, generally what would happen is that my father and some of the other therapists and professionals would skill up some of these people. And these people had amazing success with drawing out the stories and the responses from people who'd been really forgotten to the mental health world. And they went on through the confidence they got through peer support to get jobs, real jobs. And this was in the 60s and 70s. So I love what I'm seeing happening to peer support. I think it needs to go further and faster. But the other thing is, I see the value of peer support online, and I see the value of group peer support. And without, you know, trying to sound too sycophantic to your hosts this evening, Talk for Health, I love the Talk for Health model. And it is so democratic, it's so open, it's so non-professionally hidebound, yet it's rigorous, yet it cares, yet it has safety procedures in it, it has all sorts of different things. So I think we're missing a trick with peer support. Let me reel into psychedelic therapy and just put my hand up to say that I'm not going to disclose my use of recreational drugs on an open recorded forum, but I have seen the power that psychedelic substances bring in terms of insights. I'm not yet convinced as much as I need to be in terms of the trialing. I think the trialing is going in the right direction, but it's open to many abuses. I have registered myself for a psychedelic drug trial in the UK. So I'm waiting for the call, and I'm hoping that my past history won't put me as null and void for that. But, you know, psychedelic drugs, it's psilocybin, it's MDMA, LSD, ayahuasca, magic mushrooms, call it whatever you will. And all of these are controlled substances. So it's not legal outside clinical trials. And if you're following any of the conversations in Australia, it's really a really hot debate as to whether or not the government should have allowed the trialing in Australia. It's expensive. And those people who do avail themselves of private psychedelic treatments, they can range from anything from 10, 15 to 30,000. So it is expensive. And the drug is either administered in one session or up to 3 sessions. And there's, in the right conditions, there is a therapeutic team that preps the person, is there on hand if anything should be going wrong, and works with the person to see what the insights they've got afterwards. But you know, you have to be your own judge of it. But the interesting thing is, if the evidence proves to be good, the cost can be brought down. There are some amazing trials with veterans. There are some amazing trials with those who suffer significant and persistent depression, PTSD. I'm keeping an open mind. And one of the people, the scientists in the UK who brought the COVID vaccine to the fore is also a big supporter of the science behind psychedelic therapies. I wouldn't want to see psychedelics introduced without assisted therapy. So I do think one of the future roles of talking therapies is in very much a very core and central role in some of these future potential therapies. The last one I wanted to mention was single item sessions. We've been working with a children's organization, Place to Be, and we analyzed the number of sessions that counselors would have with kids. And they ranged from 8 to 28, and sometimes they were going beyond 28 sessions. And we were thinking, this can't be that great for short-term interventions or whatever. And we brought into place We wanted 8, but we settled with 10 with a clinical team, that children would have no more than 10 sessions unless it was clinically proven they needed that. And that has brought with it a change in practice, no change in outcome for the children and young people in terms of the successes and impact of the therapy. And what it's making us think, and there are a lot of organizations doing single session therapies, single sessions whereby someone is offered one single session and they are taken through a routine in that single session. And some people say at the end of that, I'm absolutely fine, I'm good to go. I've got everything I need from that. They felt heard, it's dealt with their distress, and they can move forward. So I'm wondering whether or not we will see opening up of single 2, 3, 4 sessions might be something that we see more of in the future. So, and I'm a big fan of something that makes something more accessible and more amenable and takes away some of the professional mystery that we can surround some of our so-called treatments with. So I'd like to see it very much as a human response. So as I judge what I think the future holds for talking therapies, I think it looks exceptionally bright. People will always continue to find the need to talk. Will we deprofessionalize it? I hope so. Will we open up access to a range of people to be talking therapy practitioners? I really do hope so. Will we see peer support be a central part of any future mental health service? That would be one of my wishes. Can we extend our gaze of access to talking therapies to those with severe and enduring mental illness? And can we find a way of describing mental health in a way that really embraces the social, psychological, and emotional elements of it and doesn't seek to parcel out who will be in receipt of services and who won't be? So I think any exponent of talking therapies, which you all, I guess, are interested in online this evening, the future looks very bright, but I think we have to take a little bit of a leadership role and sometimes stand up for more for what we believe in. And as we move potentially to a new government, we want to see a much more open access policy to mental health, a clearer differentiation across all the different needs, and a much more open and accessible response to people in distress. Mike, I've left 5 minutes of my hour.
Great. For some time for some additional questions or comments, do you think? Yeah, amazing. Yeah, so same again then, everyone, if you want to just pop your hand up and ask away. Gregor, I mean, I had a quick question I thought I might ask you. I'd done some research into the kind of psychedelic assisted therapies, and one of the things that I'd seen is that like it often in the kind of like warnings about it, it's like some of them are kind of what I'd seen is like, don't use these, and if you have a past experience of depression, right, or anxiety or things like that. So there's almost like I've seen warning signs to these things that are supposed to be fixing that specific problem. So how does that work? Like where do you like draw the line there?
Well, it's interesting. I think, you know, people for centuries have self-medicated, have used different substances in ways that they feel that will help them. And I think through the scientific understanding being gained by the deeper study of psychedelics, I mean, you have to remember that traditional healers and have been using psychedelics for centuries, and sometimes very successfully. And I think that it's about, there's an issue about dose and dose response. And I think what they're trying to do in the clinical trials is find the dose that will enable someone to have an opening of their neural pathways that brings some sense of deeper understanding of what they're thinking and feeling. And I think that science will be interesting. I think they're right to be cautious about dosage levels and people using obviously substances themselves. And I think that then talks of a very highly regulated, very controlled system. And I would want to see that. And if the evidence for that is good, then let's bring it into mainstream mental health treatment. If the evidence doesn't show that, then let's not. But in the 60s, there was freer experimentation, lots more clinical trials and studies, and then we had the war on drugs. And I'm not saying that was a good or a bad thing, but it means that we are catching up in the public's imagination of what could be possible by trying to undo some of the language around substances that have been around for centuries. Katie?
Hiya. I've got a few questions and they're all on different topics, so stop me if I'm asking too many. The first one is the shortage of mental health workers. Is that because recruitment is difficult or because the budget isn't big enough to have the amount that's needed? And I'm all for peer mentoring. It's probably what I want to get into as well, but I can see how that can be paying people less to do the job where there might be gaps for more professionals, psychodynamic or, you know, other types of therapy.
I mean, budgets are always limited. That's just something that we know. And health, no matter how much the budget is limited, there will always be gaps in between demand and supply. The question is, when you raise more money, what do you do? Do you put it into the things that you've always done, or do you start looking at something different? And my anxiety about the current workforce plan for the NHS is it's putting money into things, more of the things that they've always done. So more doctors, more nurses, et cetera, which for an acute healthcare system is fine. But for a health system based on population health and keeping people healthy, it's the wrong investment. And I think what we need to see is a broadening out of different categories of worker. People may say you'll be getting therapists on the cheap, but you know, I've seen amazing peer support workers do incredible things with people that psychiatric services have almost turned away or given up on. And
yeah, I resonate with that. I've had a peer support worker, and when therapists, haven't taken me on. So
so I think we could blame budgets, but I think we blame will and also the difficulty in getting past dominant professions in terms of sharing the budget to create a wider workforce. And I would be encouraged by what voluntary sector organizations are doing, community interest companies like Talk for Health. I mean, the evidence is there that when you open it up, people fill that space with life experience and other forms of expertise, which go a long way to meeting the social and psychological needs that people have.
Can I have another question? I was just wondering, in terms of preventative, and it's fairly new having counsellors work in schools. I know it's been around a while, but are there any longitudinal studies looking at whether if children have counselling early, I don't know, what would be the effect later on? Would it mean less people are accessing it later on?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? There have been some attempts with longitudinal studies, but not of the power that we potentially need them to have. There is no doubt that counselling makes a difference. The question is proving it. And what we work in research is a thing called the counterfactual. If this wasn't there, if the counselling in school wasn't available, what would the difference be? And then that opens you up to very different forms of trialing and ethics and morals about how you do that. So I think the jury's not, it's not that the jury's out, there is a benefit to early intervention and counselling. The question is, what kind of counselling has the biggest effect? How many sessions does it need? And what does it need to be supplemented with? Because you can counsel the child, but not change the parental environment. You can counsel the child, but not change the teacher environment. You can counsel the child, but the peer don't value the counselling that the child has got. And you can counsel the child knowing that they're going home to one meal a day, if that, significant hardship and poverty, and you wonder whether or not you need to be looking at a therapeutic relationship alongside something that is deeper and more systemic in terms of their social environment. So Katie, it's a complex question, And that's why people are moving to things like a whole school approach, where they work with parents, the teachers, the children, counseling groups, art therapy. The more the merrier, and that whole school environment, because a single intervention in one place doesn't always do the trick.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I'll leave my last question. It goes off tangent a bit.
I like off tangent. Mike, we're at 3 minutes past 7. I know you've got another hour with colleagues.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Anthony's got his hand up. If maybe if we just take Anthony's question and then we can move on. Is that okay?
Sure, of course.
Yeah, hello again. It just builds a little bit upon what's just been talked about. We talked about supply and demand, and we looked at a lot's been talked about the supply of treatments and help and therapy and support. But what about the demand, reducing the demand? Why is there such a high demand? What's going on that? And it's that's another area really. The social and the structural change in society that need to be made.
Yeah.
So people don't need that type of help or support. That it's a natural part of life.
Well, you're going into the $1 million question here, is as our journey towards greater awareness and enlightenment about mental health, have we overcomplicated? Are we looking for professional solutions to life challenges and problems? Yes, of course we are. And I've been following the whole journey of the well-being movement for a couple of decades now. And I really like the work of the Wellbeing What Works Centre in England. And I was one of the founding directors of that. So I would say that, wouldn't I? But, we know that the way we are living our lives is not conducive to a happy psychosocial existence. And yet, when push comes to shove, we expect mental health services to solve this existential crisis that we're walking into with our eyes wide open. And, fair be it for me to say that any judge of a society's worth based on gross domestic product is to undervalue the whole human existence and to grow unsustainable practices that we and the planet can ill afford. So you're going to get me on a well-being soapbox, and I don't mean well-being where I will then give you a link to Gwyneth Paltrow's website where you can buy all sorts of well-being products. That's not what I mean. It's something deep and fundamental. And a few governments have attempted to put their foot in the water of that. And the more that do that, the better, because we could solve a great number of our mental health problems overnight by changing our social policies. Eradicating childhood poverty would be good. Having a progressive immigration policy would be another one. And rather than feathering the bed of those who are already well enough off, we should be reinvesting in our public services and bringing a lot more of those back under national control. So I've given away my political persuasions in answer to your question, Anthony. But I do think that sometimes when we build up the mental health crisis, we want to be careful what we wish for, because some of what then comes is not the things we need most, which is that continuing social, psychological response, human interaction, and human connection that talking therapies and their like provide us and really give us the sustenance we need to carry on living quite complex lives.
Thank you. You got my vote.
Thank you, Gregor. We didn't manage to get to Carol at the end of the first session, and I know Carol's got her hand up now. Would you mind just taking one last question from Carol, and then we'll move on? Is that okay?
Yeah, I'd be delighted.
Thank you.
Hi, Carol.
Hi, and it's not really a question, it's a quick observation. Thinking around psychiatry and the fact that the psychiatric professionals have so little time, they're so stretched these days. They seem to be putting much less emphasis on talking or even getting to know the person. It's all about diagnose it, medicate it, and out the other end. And I'm thinking that comment about Robin Murray about sort of trying to bring it back, I can understand why he would say that at Congress, because I think they're getting a bit jittery, maybe, that they realise that maybe this approach isn't the right one. And I'm thinking maybe there is some hope. And I also,
there is, Carol, I desperately believe there is. I know a lot of psychiatrists. I am really, in this year's election for the president of the Royal College of Psychiatrists, we had 3 exceptional candidates. And Laddie Smith, who got it, is an exceptional candidate who believes in social determinants. She believes in social justice. She believes in addressing inequalities. She's
Yep.
wonderful. And Adrian, the previous and now past president, has been great. But one of the candidates who was putting himself up was a guy called Russell Radicke. And Russell is known to talk for health. And Russell was basing his whole soapbox and prospectus on relational psychiatry, the relationship between and within and between human beings. And he nearly got it. So something is shifting and changing, and they want that back. They embraced social psychiatry in the 60s and 70s and somehow lost their way to the biomedical, potentially lured by large sums of drug monies and skiing in Aspen or whatever. And I think this is a profession that is really wanting to reconnect with its soul. And that's why whenever people bash psychiatry, they reduce their ability to come to a much wider field and fold of people. And I think, like you, Carol, that we should be welcoming them, showing them not the mistakes of their past, but showing them the way forward is through good human relationships. And that includes our views, attitudes, and tone and style of when we speak about psychiatry and with psychiatrists.
Yeah, and I for a while I was the patient representative on the Royal College of Psychiatrists, their psychiatric trainees committee. So I would see the junior doctors who are coming through sort of really motivated and really thinking along these lines. And then gradually during their training, it was really sad because they did just get indoctrinated in, you've got to get your diagnosis right. You've got to work out which medication is right. And it became more and more narrow. But I think now, because the debate has opened up and because there are lots of organizations such as this one, and there's another organization which I really want to draw people's attention to, it's called A Disorder for Everyone, which really looks at the idea of, is it a mental illness or is it just reacting to an insane society, And they have a brilliant conference. Every September they have a brilliant conference, and they include psychiatrists such as Joanna Moncrief, who's sort of
fantastic.
And Gabor Mate has been, also and so look up A Disorder for Everyone. Just put AD, if you just put AD for number 4E, and the conference, it's just a donation to attend. It's in September, and you can just give a £2, £5 donation, and you will have some mind-bending ideas around these things.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
And that is what I would encourage people to do. And in Scotland, we've got this saying that, you can see the mountain in the distance, but you've got to go over one hill, over the next hill, over the next hill. Well, we used to say, and this is not pejorative, but we used to say, if you want to know what the future really looks like, follow the loon over the hill. Loon means lad, but I think you get where I'm going. Sometimes the people with the craziest ideas are furthest ahead of us in their thinking. And I sometimes think we should be following more of the people that you've been talking about and just looking over those hills. Thank you, Karen.
Thank you.
Amazing.
Mike, back to you.
Yes, thank you so much, Gregor. It's been a really interesting talk, and I hope everyone else has enjoyed it as much as I have. And thank you all so much for engaging and asking really thoughtful questions, and it's been a really great discussion. And thanks again, Gregor. I'll just give a chance just to say, for everyone who is new to Talk for Health, I'm just putting in a quick questionnaire into the chat now. I'm just going to pause recording as well so we can